Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Finn never imagined that the truth would come out this way, not in a moment so raw, so merciless, and so utterly irreversible, but once the words began spilling from his mouth, there was no stopping them, no rewinding the damage already done, because Steffi stood frozen in front of him, her eyes wide and glassy, as the reality of his confession crashed into her with the force of a tidal wave, shattering everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her family, and even herself, and it all began with Finn admitting that the DNA test he had secretly ordered, under the guise of medical caution, had revealed something far more devastating than anyone could have anticipated, something that didn't just threaten their future but rewrote their entire past, because the results confirmed that a child had been conceived during a time when Finn and Steffi were supposed to be rebuilding trust, healing wounds, and recommitting to one another. Yet the timing didn't add up, the dates didn't align. And as Finn struggled to explain the discrepancies, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt, Steffi felt the ground give way beneath her feet, realizing that the man she trusted most had not only betrayed her emotionally but had carried on a secret affair that resulted in a baby whose existence he had concealed until the science made silence impossible. And as Finn admitted that fear, shame, and cowardice had driven him to hide the truth, Steffi's devastation deepened when she realized that her own recent doubts, those nagging instincts she had pushed aside, were never paranoia but warnings she chose to ignore, and now those warnings echoed loudly in her mind as Finn revealed that the affair hadn't been a fleeting mistake but a complicated, emotionally charged entanglement that spiraled out of control, one that blurred boundaries and shattered vows. And when Steffi demanded to know how long he had known about the pregnancy, Finn hesitated just long enough to confirm her worst fears, because he had known for weeks, months even, carrying the burden alone while pretending everything was fine, while kissing her goodnight, while holding their family together with lies layered over lies, and that revelation hurt more than the affair itself, because it meant that every tender moment since then had been tainted by deception, every promise hollow, every reassurance a performance. And when Finn confessed that the DNA test wasn't just about the baby's paternity but had also raised disturbing questions about Steffi's own past, questions she never expected to confront, her shock turned into disbelief, because suddenly Finn was suggesting that secrets didn't belong to him alone, that the test had uncovered inconsistencies tied to Steffi herself, implying that the truth they were facing was bigger than one betrayal and more dangerous than either of them could handle alone. And as he spoke about bloodlines, timelines, and hidden truths buried under years of silence, Steffi felt physically ill, her hands trembling as she tried to process how quickly her identity, her marriage, and her sense of control were unraveling. And the cruel irony was that Finn framed his confession as an act of honesty, as if revealing everything now could somehow redeem months of lies, but Steffi saw it for what it was, a betrayal exposed not by conscience but by consequence, by science that refused to be manipulated. And as her emotions surged between rage, heartbreak, and disbelief, she lashed out, demanding to know how he could look her in the eye every day knowing another woman carried his child, knowing that a living reminder of his betrayal existed somewhere in the world. And Finn's silence in that moment spoke louder than any excuse, confirming that he had already imagined a future where he somehow managed both lives without being caught. A fantasy Steffi obliterated with a single devastating realization: her marriage had become a lie long before this confession. And when she accused him of using the DNA test not as a tool for truth but as a weapon to justify his actions, Finn broke down, admitting that fear had consumed him, fear of losing her, fear of public shame, fear of becoming the very man he once swore he'd never be. But none of it mattered anymore because Steffi's heart had already hardened into something unrecognizable, something scarred by the knowledge that love, no matter how fiercely protected, could still be violated in the most intimate way. And as the conversation spiraled into accusations and revelations, Steffi realized that Finn's betrayal didn't exist in isolation but had ripple effects that threatened her entire world, her children, her family legacy, her trust in her own judgment. And when Finn admitted that the woman he had the affair with knew about Steffi, knew about the family, and still chose to continue the relationship, Steffi felt humiliation burn through her veins, because this wasn't just betrayal. It was calculated disrespect. And the worst blow came when Finn revealed that the baby's existence was no longer a secret, that legal and emotional consequences were inevitable, forcing Steffi to confront a future where the child would always be present, always a reminder, always a fracture point she could never fully escape, and as she struggled to breathe through the pain, she questioned whether the DNA test had been destiny's cruel intervention or punishment for believing that love could survive anything. And when Finn begged her not to leave, insisting that he wanted to fight for their family, Steffi laughed bitterly, recognizing that the man standing before her was no longer the partner she once believed in but a stranger capable of unimaginable deceit, and in that moment, her world truly shattered, not in a loud explosion but in a quiet, irreversible collapse, because even if she stayed, even if she forgave, the innocence was gone, the trust destroyed, and the truth had carved a permanent scar into her life, leaving her to face the impossible question of whether love was enough to survive betrayal layered with lies, secrets, and a child that would forever tie her to the man who broke her. And as Steffi walked away, leaving Finn alone with the wreckage of his choices, it became clear that this revelation wasn't just the end of a marriage as she knew it but the beginning of a long, painful reckoning that would change everyone involved forever, because secrets, once exposed, don't simply disappear, they reshape lives, redefine relationships, and leave nothing untouched in their wake. Finn never imagined that the truth would come out this way, not in a moment so raw, so merciless, and so utterly irreversible, and as he stood there watching Steffi absorb every word, he felt as though time itself had slowed to punish him, stretching each second so she could feel the full weight of what he had done, because once the confession began there was no way to soften it, no careful phrasing capable of dulling the impact. No apology large enough to contain the damage, and the words poured out of him with a desperate momentum that mirrored the chaos inside his chest, as though speaking faster might somehow make the consequences arrive more gently, but they didn't, because Steffi stood frozen, her body rigid, her breath shallow, her eyes wide and glassy as if she were staring at something catastrophic yet struggling to comprehend that it was real, and in that stillness Finn felt the enormity of his betrayal settle between them like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating, filling the room with an unbearable tension that had been building for months, hidden beneath smiles, routines, and shared silences, and it all began with his admission about the DNA test, the one he had ordered in secret under the careful disguise of medical concern, a decision he had justified to himself as responsible and cautious, but which now stood exposed as the first domino in a chain of deception that had quietly reshaped their marriage. Because the results hadn't simply answered a question, they had detonated a truth that neither of them could escape, confirming that a child had been conceived during a time when Finn and Steffi were supposed to be healing, rebuilding, recommitting to one another after surviving storms that had nearly torn them apart before, and as Finn explained the timelines, the dates, the discrepancies that refused to align no matter how desperately he wanted them to, his voice cracked under the strain of guilt and fear, and Steffi felt the ground give way beneath her feet, realizing with sickening clarity that the man she trusted most hadn't just failed her in a moment of weakness but had betrayed her in a way that rewrote their entire history, because this wasn't about one bad decision, it was about sustained deception, about choices repeated day after day while he looked her in the eye and promised loyalty, and as the reality settled in, she understood that the affair had resulted in a baby whose existence he had hidden until science itself made silence impossible. And that realization struck her harder than any confession of desire or loneliness ever could, because it meant that his betrayal was no longer abstract or confined to the past, it was alive, growing, and destined to exist beyond apologies and explanations, and when Finn admitted that fear, shame, and cowardice had driven him to hide the truth, that he had convinced himself he was protecting her. Protecting their family, Steffi felt something inside her fracture, because she recognized those justifications for what they were, excuses layered over lies, and the devastation deepened as she realized that her own doubts, the instincts she had silenced because she wanted so badly to believe in their love, had never been paranoia, they had been warnings, and now those warnings echoed relentlessly in her mind, mocking her trust, as Finn revealed that the affair hadn't been fleeting or meaningless but a complicated, emotionally charged entanglement that spiraled beyond control, one that blurred boundaries, fed on vulnerability, and shattered vows piece by piece, and when she demanded to know how long he had known about the pregnancy, the hesitation in his response was its own confession, because that pause confirmed everything she feared, that he had known for weeks, months even, carrying the truth alone while pretending everything was normal, while kissing her goodnight, while holding their family together with gestures that now felt grotesquely hollow, And that revelation hurt more than the affair itself, because it meant that every shared moment since then had been contaminated by deception, every laugh rehearsed, every reassurance a performance. And when Finn tried to explain that the DNA test wasn't just about confirming the baby's paternity but had also raised unsettling questions about Steffi's own past, her shock turned to disbelief, because suddenly he was implying that secrets didn't belong to him alone, that the truth unraveling before them was larger and more dangerous than a single betrayal. And as he spoke about bloodlines, timelines, and truths buried beneath years of silence, Steffi felt physically ill, her hands trembling as she tried to grasp how quickly her identity, her marriage, and her sense of control were dissolving. And the cruel irony of it all was that Finn framed his confession as honesty, as if revealing everything now could somehow redeem the months of calculated silence, but Steffi saw through that illusion with painful clarity, recognizing that this truth hadn't been offered freely but forced into the open by consequence, by science that refused to bend to fear or convenience. And as her emotions surged between rage, heartbreak, humiliation, and disbelief, she demanded to know how he could look at her every day knowing another woman carried his child, knowing that somewhere in the world existed a living reminder of his betrayal. And when Finn fell silent, unable to answer, that silence spoke louder than any apology, because it confirmed that he had already imagined a future where he somehow managed both realities without being exposed, a fantasy Steffi shattered in an instant by acknowledging what she had been avoiding, that her marriage had become a lie long before this moment. And when she accused him of using the DNA test not as a tool for truth but as a weapon to justify his actions, Finn finally broke down, admitting that fear had consumed him, fear of losing her, fear of public shame, fear of becoming the man he once despised, but none of it mattered anymore, because Steffi's heart had hardened into something unrecognizable, something scarred by the knowledge that love, no matter how fiercely protected, could still be violated at its most intimate core. And as the conversation spiraled, pulling with it years of shared memories now poisoned by doubt, Steffi realized that Finn's betrayal didn't exist in isolation but rippled outward, threatening her children, her family legacy, her faith in her own judgment. And when Finn admitted that the woman he had the affair with knew about Steffi, knew about the marriage and the family and still chose to continue, humiliation burned through her veins, because this wasn't just betrayal, it was calculated disrespect. And the final blow came when Finn revealed that the baby's existence was no longer secret, that legal and emotional consequences were inevitable, forcing Steffi to confront a future where the child would always be present, always a reminder, always a fracture she could never fully escape. And as she struggled to breathe through the pain, she questioned whether the DNA test had been destiny's intervention or punishment for believing that love could survive anything. And when Finn begged her not to leave, insisting that he wanted to fight for their family, Steffi laughed bitterly, recognizing that the man before her was no longer the partner she had built her life with but a stranger capable of extraordinary deceit. And in that moment her world truly shattered, not with an explosion but with a quiet, irreversible collapse, because even if she stayed, even if she forgave, the innocence was gone, the trust destroyed, and the truth had carved a permanent scar into her life, leaving her to face the impossible question of whether love could ever be enough to survive betrayal layered with lies, secrets, and a child that would forever tie her to the man who broke her. And as Steffi finally walked away, leaving Finn alone amid the wreckage of his choices, it became clear that this revelation marked not just the end of a marriage as she knew it but the beginning of a long, painful reckoning that would redefine everyone involved, because secrets, once exposed, do not simply disappear, they reshape lives, redefine relationships, and leave nothing untouched in their relentless wake, forcing each person to confront who they are when the illusions fall away. And as Finn stood there listening to the echo of her footsteps fade, he understood with devastating clarity that some truths arrive too late to save what they destroy, and that love, when suffocated by fear and dishonesty, can rot from the inside out until only regret remains, a lesson etched into his life by a confession that could never be undone. Steffi didn't stop walking until the air itself felt different, until the walls that had closed in on her began to loosen their grip, yet even then the weight of what she had learned clung to her like a second skin, because leaving the room didn't mean leaving the truth behind, it followed her relentlessly, replaying in fragments and flashes that refused to settle into anything coherent. And as she moved through the quiet of the house, every familiar object felt suddenly foreign, transformed. into evidence of a life that no longer existed in the way she had believed. The couch where they had sat together planning a future now felt like a stage where a lie had been carefully rehearsed. The photographs on the walls seemed to mock her with frozen smiles captured during moments she now questioned, wondering how many of them had been taken while Finn was already carrying the knowledge that would ultimately destroy them. And with each step she took, her chest tightened, not only from heartbreak but from a dawning awareness that this betrayal had robbed her of something far deeper than trust in him. It had shaken her trust in herself, because she prided herself on strength, on intuition, on the ability to survive chaos and come out the other side with clarity. Yet here she was, blindsided, realizing that her instincts had whispered the truth long before science forced it into the open. And that realization hurt almost as much as the affair itself, because it meant she had silenced her own voice in the name of love, and now that silence echoed painfully loud, and behind her, Finn remained where she left him, standing in the ruins of a confession that had taken on a life of its own, the room heavy with the aftermath of words that could never be reclaimed, and for the first time since the truth emerged, he allowed himself to feel the full measure of what he had lost, because while he had feared this moment for months, fantasizing about explanations and forgiveness and second chances, the reality was infinitely worse, stripped of hope and illusion, because Steffi hadn't screamed or thrown things or begged him to fix it. She had simply walked away, and that quiet departure terrified him more than anger ever could, as he replayed her expression in his mind, not explosive or hysterical but hollowed, as though something essential had been carved out of her. And he realized with sickening clarity that he had done that, not in a single moment of weakness but through a series of calculated choices that prioritized his fear over her right to the truth. And as he sank into a chair, his head in his hands, the weight of responsibility pressed down on him, because the confession hadn't absolved him, it had only begun the reckoning, and outside that room, Steffi's world continued to unravel in quieter, more insidious ways, because once the shock began to wear off, the questions surged forward, relentless and merciless, demanding answers she wasn't sure she wanted, questions about timelines and motives and how deep the deception truly ran, and beneath those questions lurked a more terrifying one: what did this mean for her future, for the life she had built brick by brick with the belief that she was standing on solid ground? And as she reached for her phone, her hands trembling, she realized how quickly isolation could descend, because who did she call first? Who could she trust with a truth that felt too heavy to speak aloud? And in that hesitation she felt the loneliness settle in, sharp and unexpected, because betrayal doesn't just break hearts, it fractures support systems, forcing the betrayed to navigate pain while protecting themselves from further harm. And as the hours passed, Finn remained alone with his thoughts, each one more damning than the last, because he could no longer hide behind secrecy or denial. The truth was out, and with it came consequences he could no longer control, legal, emotional, and social, all converging into a future he hadn't fully considered when he chose silence. And he found himself thinking about the child, not as an abstract complication but as a living reality, a human being who would one day ask questions, whose existence would forever tie him to the worst decision of his life. And the gravity of that responsibility settled uneasily in his chest, because he knew that no matter what happened with Steffi, the child deserved honesty and presence. Yet the thought of navigating that truth while facing the woman he had betrayed felt impossible. And elsewhere, Steffi sat alone, the silence around her thick and oppressive, as the truth continued to seep into every corner of her consciousness, reframing memories she once cherished. Conversations she had believed were genuine now felt suspicious, and she wondered how many times Finn had looked at her while thinking about another woman, about another life forming beyond her awareness. And that thought ignited a surge of anger that cut through the numbness, because this wasn't just about heartbreak, it was about agency, about the fact that decisions had been made about her life without her consent, that she had been denied the opportunity to choose how she wanted to respond, and that violation stirred something fierce within her, a determination not to be defined solely by what had been done to her, but as the night stretched on, that resolve battled exhaustion and grief, because strength doesn't erase pain, it simply carries it forward. And as dawn approached, neither of them slept, each trapped in their own version of the same reality, separated by truth yet bound by its consequences. And when morning finally arrived, it brought with it no clarity, only the undeniable knowledge that nothing would ever be the same, because reconciliation, if it were even possible, would require dismantling the entire foundation of their relationship and rebuilding it with honesty that had been absent for far too long, and even that possibility felt uncertain, fragile, and distant. And as the days unfolded, the truth continued to ripple outward, touching family, stirring whispers, forcing conversations that Steffi wasn't ready to have, yet could not avoid, because secrets rarely stay contained once exposed. They demand acknowledgement, they force alignment, and each interaction became a test of her resilience, as she navigated sympathy, judgment, and curiosity, all while trying to protect herself from drowning in the narrative others would inevitably create about her marriage. And Finn, too, faced the consequences of visibility, because confession stripped him of the ability to hide, compelling him to confront not only Steffi's pain but his own reflection, one that revealed a man capable of betraying the values he once claimed defined him, and that realization haunted him, pushing him toward a reckoning he could no longer postpone, because whether Steffi ever forgave him or not, he would have to live with what he had done, and in that space